afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the HR Congress podcast today. My name is Ben Churchhouse, and I'm joined today by Melissa Boggs, the Chief Scrum Master for the Scrum Alliance. Together with the Chief Product Owner and their staff, Melissa seeks to fulfill the Scrum Alliance's vision of transforming the world of work. Melissa has extensive experience with leadership, business, and product development, particularly with applying, consulting, and coaching agile values and principles that span executive teams, software teams, marketers, and educators in various industries. In addition to her experience in education, Melissa possesses a deep understanding of agile values and principles, organizational change, leadership agility, and has proven expertise in enabling organizations to reach their full potential. So thank you for joining me today, Melissa. You'll be joining us at the HR Congress along with Scrum Alliance this year, and you will be particularly speaking in the talent and culture track, which we'll get onto your session a little bit later. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Ben. I'm really excited for the podcast and for the conference, later this year.
So for our listeners who are not aware about Scrum Alliance, could you please explain a little bit more about what the organization does and its place within the world of work at the moment?
Sure, I'd love to. So I'll start with Scrum in general first, and then I can kind of explain how we as an organization support Scrum and its practitioners. So Scrum actually began in the software development space, and it was focused on iterative and incremental work and helping people to work in teams, because our belief is that when people work together in cross-functional teams, self-organized teams, and they are kind of radically focused on meeting customer needs, and then in order to do that, kind of doing this iterative incremental work, that's when we believe that you not only get the best work, but you have the most fulfillment, the most joy in your work. And so Scrum as a framework, it's a lightweight framework that describes a way of working in sprints, is what we call it. So could be 2 up to 4 week sprints. And within those sprints, there are ceremonies that are intended to help you plan the work, review the work, and then talk about continuous improvement. So one of my favorite things about Scrum is what we call the retrospective. You can kind of think about a post-mortem, but I always tell people nobody died, hopefully. And so retrospective is a little bit more reflective and maybe a little bit more joyful. And so there's a number of things involved in that framework, but overall it's about meeting customer needs, doing it quickly, delivering value quickly, and then within the team or the organization, having real purpose and joy and having everything you need in that team and everyone that you need to actually deliver the work. So limiting dependencies, trying to create teams that have everything. As Scrum Alliance, we are a membership organization and a certifying body. So we are the certifiers of the Certified Scrum Master, Certified Scrum Product Owner. There are a number of other certifications, but we do a lot more than that. Mostly we're focused on supporting people who are using Scrum because, as you could tell just from the way I described it, it's a little bit different. And so it requires a mindset shift. It requires thinking differently about your work, thinking differently about how you work with people. And so, we want to be the organization that helps support people who are doing that with resources, connections. I'm trying to think, conferences. We have a couple different conferences a year. We call them gatherings. And so our goal, our mission is to help transform the world of work, but to do so, we're supporting practitioners who are doing that work. So it's not just all about us. It's actually about, the people who are out there in the trenches.
You've sort of touched on it already, but do we really need to rethink the fundamental practice of management, given that, for example, talent management is something that's 50, 60, 70 years old? What is it that's changing, and how is it applicable for HR?
Ooh, this is one of my favorite questions. So first of all, everything is changing, right? I am actually of the generation that they call the Zennials because I had an analog childhood and a digital adulthood, right? And so I've seen this shift just in the time that I've been in the workplace with the interwebs. It's introduced a much faster pace of life a much faster connection between businesses and their customers. And with that connection comes responsibility. We can't hide behind, well, we're not putting out a product for a year, so we don't know if they're going to like it. And if they don't like it, we have another year to get out, something better. We can't hide behind that at all. And so we have to, as organizations, be much more nimble or agile, if you will. And in doing so, we have to build our organizations to be able to listen closely and then move quickly. And so in terms of how management needs to change, we have to be able to, I don't want to use buzzwords, but like literally enable and empower our teams to make decisions because they are much closer to the work. So that's where the self-organization piece comes in, that we are hugely embracing here in our organization. But that said, you can't just say, okay, self-organize and like throw people in the deep end. And so from a talent management perspective, from the people that you hire, from how you make sure they're skilled up, the focus should really be on how do we give them everything that they need in that team to do the work and to confidently make decisions. How do we connect them to the customer, in a very real way? Not there are 3 layers between me and the customer, but if I have a question, I can actually find a way to get, something in front of the customer or ask the customer a question. And so, management then becomes, again, a buzzword, but servant leadership. How do we serve those teams and get them the information, the resources, the people, and the connection that they need to make those decisions and have confidence in that?
I should point out that it's pretty hard to talk about this subject without hitting some buzzwords. So I know that it's probably going to have quite a few of those in this conversation. So apologies to everyone listening, but it is kind of essential. And on that point, it leads me into the question about misconceptions, because we know with agile transformations, there's a lot of, again, buzzwords, a lot of talk, a lot of spin out there. What are some of the biggest myths and or misconceptions that you see in the world at the moment?
So I can speak to those, but I'm going to back up just a little bit and just say something that's not the myth. Now, I've been in this space for about 10 years, so I've seen it evolve from kind of the early adopter to now much more mainstream. And while that's really exciting, obviously, for those of us who believe in this movement, it also means that as it has become more mainstream, sometimes you lose the value of what it was, right? And so one thing I would say is that the agile piece, of which Scrum is one framework, right? So we're part of a larger movement. Agile itself is a set of 4 values and 12 principles, period. So anything else that is sold to people is perhaps building on that, but it is not agile itself. Agile is a noun that goes with values and principles. So you'll often hear me if people say, like, are you doing agile? I will subtly but kindly correct them and say, are you embracing agile values and principles? Is that what you mean? So with that, the myths and misconceptions that have kind of grown from it becoming more mainstream are that, one, that it's a methodology, and I don't mean to correct anyone, but it is values and principles, and it is a movement. And with that, there are a number of frameworks. A myth is that it is micromanagement. And as I just explained, and I won't rehash it, but it really is about self-organization. There is definitely always a transition from I, as a leader, held all the knowledge up until this moment. I had all the knowledge. I had all the resources. I made all of the decisions. So there is definitely a transition where you have to help those teams get skilled up and have the context. But by no means were Scrum or any of the Agile frameworks ever intended to be micromanagement. I feel as if they can be used as a weapon. One of the talks that I give, I very clearly say, like, use your powers for good and not for evil. Scrum was intended to provide some structure so that, we don't have total anarchy, but within that structure, teams should be empowered and given the tools to do their work. And, things like story points and velocity are not intended to be weapons. They're not intended to be the new metric that you hold against people. And so that's probably the biggest misconception. And within that, there's, 200 more misconceptions.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the idea of speed and velocity in today's world, because on one hand, we're constantly being told that we need to adapt, that we need to move quickly, to think fast, to change, to evolve. And yet, on the other hand, we do need time to reflect and think about where the strategy needs to go, where the business needs to go, where we need to go as people. And of course, with the self-organizing aspect of Scrum, there is room for that. But there still is this sort of perception that the wheels must keep turning, the daily stand-ups must keep happening, everything must keep spinning. How do we as business leaders, as people in the business world, hold these two things in our hands and say, how do we reconcile them?
I think you hit on another myth, which is that, and I know you addressed it, but which is that, when you become agile, planning goes out the window, which is, not it at all. We have a concept that actually comes from Lean that is just-in-time planning. And the reason for that is really, you want to plan, but you want to plan just enough to invest just enough money or just enough time to test out your hypothesis. Because what we learned from kind of the waterfall days, if you will, is you can spend way too much time and way too much money planning something that you never actually do. Or you plan it and you do it and it was a complete waste of time because nobody uses it. And so it's certainly a balance. And I would even say as a leader, it's a skill to understand what is just enough planning. Do we know what hypothesis we are trying to prove or disprove? If you think about the scientific method when we were kids, what am we trying to prove or disprove with this particular product or initiative or service? And what is kind of the least amount of planning that we can do to test that, but still be thoughtful, like you said. So it's definitely a balance, but planning does not go out the window. And maybe the least amount of planning is 3 months, or maybe it's 6 months, or maybe it's, I have a 3-year plan. And I'll say this is kind of where we are with Scrum Alliance. We have a 3 to 5 year plan, but the closer in it is, the more crystal it is, right? The more crystal clear our objectives and our vision is, and the further out we're willing to say, I'm not going to spend time planning something, and I'm using air quotes, 3, 4, 5 years from now, when I have no idea what the world is going to do. Not only do we not know what we're going to do, but we don't know what the world's going to look like 5 years from now. And I think that's the willingness to do that, the willingness to say that we don't know, is where we're actually able to learn.
So how can HR professionals in particular learn more about the core principles of agility and Scrum? What are the steps that you would advise them so that they can take some ideas to their organization, so that they can start influencing their organization?
Awesome question. So the first place I would start would be agilemanifesto.org. When I referred to the 4 values and 12 principles, those were drafted by a group of people in 2001. Interestingly, what a lot of people don't know, just really quick sidebar, is that Scrum, Lean, Kanban, all of these things existed before in isolation. And Agile, quote unquote, came about in 2001 when all of them realized, hey, we're all doing something a little bit different. Kind of joke and refer to them as the Star Wars rebels. They're all oh, we're all, pushing up against what exists. And so they came together to say, well, what's similar about what we do, that we could draft a set of values and principles. So you can find those there. That's where I would always start, because then you can check. If someone's trying to sell you something, basically, you can check against, does this actually align with the values and principles? If it doesn't, then they may just be trying to sell you something. Okay. There's a wealth of information. Of course, I'm going to plug our own website. There's a wealth of information at scrumalliance.org for all different angles and perspectives. We have webinars, we have articles. Obviously, there's value in looking at our membership and becoming part of our organization. But, there's also plenty there, even if you're not a member. Mm-hmm. So those two places is where I would start. I would also say there's actually a very, very vibrant community on Twitter. So for those who are on Twitter, if you go to just #Agile or #Scrum, you'll find tons of people having interesting conversations all over the world.
So I'd like to move on to your session upcoming at the HR Congress in November, which will be in the Talent and Culture track, if I believe. Could you please tell our listeners a little more about what they can expect from that session?
Sure. I'm really excited about this one. So the basic premise of my talk is that the only way that you shift or even are aware of your culture is to be aware of storytelling. And so when you think about ancient tribes, the only way that they had to perpetuate their culture or maintain their culture was by telling stories from generation to generation. We do the same thing in our families. Like, I can literally think about moments where I was sitting at my grandmother's feet. She's in her recliner and she's telling me stories about my family. And now she's gone and I'm telling those stories to my kids. And it's more than just telling a story. It's that those stories actually shape the way that we see the world, the traditions that we either maintain or create, what our habits and what our behaviors are. Often our habits and behaviors are either a reflection or a rejection of those stories in any sort of culture. And so through storytelling and just amplifying the stories that matter, the stories that align with our values, we have an opportunity to shift our culture if we need that, or to just, we have an amazing culture, keep telling that story so that, as new people come into the organization, they are kind of having that passed on to them as well. And so I talk about, there's actually 4 different types of stories. And so I'll be kind of talking about those, kind of a top down, bottom up, inside out, and outside in are the 4 types of stories that I refer to in storytelling and to storytelling culture.
Okay, fantastic. So how can people get in contact with you and with the Scrum Alliance if they wish to learn more?
Sure. So scrumalliance.org, as I mentioned, that's our website. Tons of resources there. I am probably most active on Twitter. So if people really want to get to me the fastest, my Twitter handle is not straightforward. So it is at Hummingbird Agility, but that is spelled at HM as in Mary, N as in Nancy, G, BIRD, Agility. And then, we're also at Scrum Alliance on Twitter, of course. So those are probably the easiest ways to reach us or me.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate the early morning start there for you. And I'll be fascinated to hear your presentation in Nice this November. So thank you again. And look forward to meeting soon.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.